Well, firstly, thanks very much for letting me make this presentation under my architecture. And I'm going to focus really on Gaeltacht, or the Gaeltacht Quarter, which has been a long-term interest and has been central to what might be praxis for me for a long period of time. It's been involved in both the practice in various bodies, through some research, and now currently through teaching. And this run through, which I'll try and keep a control of time, is really a kind of a series of fragments and notations. And I should first of all say that it comes with a great deal of thanks to all of those who have helped me in terms of trying to deliver and develop some of these projects. That included colleagues in Mackel and Doherty Architects, McGurk Architects, and Paul McAllister Architects, and of course all those who come from the language and community activist kind of background. Some of you may not know what Gaeltacht means as a term, and it's really an area or a region or a place in which people generally spend most of their time, most of their business life, using Irish as their medium of communication. And generally, the Gaeltacht areas have been in rural places, although there have been various attempts to try and build more urban Gaeltachts, and there is one currently in Dublin, and we have been developing one in West Belfast for certainly officially the last 20 years, but certainly probably much more than that, over 50 years actually. A number of years ago, probably going back into the late 1960s or thereabouts, there were a number of families who decided they wanted to build homes for themselves and to use Irish as their communication. They looked for a number of sites. They looked for sites in Donegal, where there's a couple of Gaeltacht areas. They looked for sites in Tyrone, in a rural part of County Tyrone, and they also eventually found a site in an area of West Belfast. The site they looked at was 12 acres of land. They couldn't afford 12 acres. That land was then costing £120,000, but they could afford just about 2 acres. So they paid £10,000 for 2 acres of land in the mid to late 1960s. And then they built their own homes, and they built it themselves. And there were a number of founding families. They started off with 8 founding families, and then eventually 5 built the houses together. And the first houses were finished and occupied in the late 1969. Although they weren't actually finished, they were a bit more finished than this image, but they were still works going on, because not just that they were ordinary people doing their own work, they were also trying to do their work, raise their family, have an employment, bring money in, and in the evening times and weekends build their own homes. They were serviced and helped by an architect, by a solicitor, and an academic from Queen's, who all collectively gave them the support and the kind of basis for their idea to grow within the area. And all of this, in a way, came from 2 things that have a much kind of longer lineage. And the first of those really is the notion of self-help. The idea of self-help was first promoted really about the 1850s in England by a liberalist and chartist, Walter Smiles, whose son, ironically, was a Unionist MP in the 1920s and 30s in Belfast. But Walter Smiles wrote this book about self-help and self-education, in that the ordinary person, the ordinary working man or woman, could, with education, lift themselves and contribute more to society. Now, that self-help notion ebbed and flowed over the kind of decades and decades from then to the 1920s and onwards. But by the 1949 or thereabouts, it was picked up again by Tony Benn's uncle, in fact, in England, was developed very well by those in Scandinavia and the east coast of the States. And it was the basis upon which the people who made these houses on the Shaw's Road decided to grab as kind of philosophy. And that was it. You rely on self-help. You have a kind of, the phrase they used was Johnny na Habari, which is really means to do it, don't just talk about it, and see that there's value in doing that. But they also were influenced by a writer in Irish, Martin O'Kine, who was writing from the 1940s, 1950s onwards, and he lobbied very strongly for the idea that people should make their own Gaeltacht. They should build their own street. The Southern government tried over many, many decades from the 30s onwards, until eventually a report they produced in 1963. And that report basically said there should be a way to revive the Irish by building what they were calling Irish community units. Now, it didn't have much legs, was never adopted and didn't go anywhere. But within all that, there was a seed of an idea, and the people named in this slide were those who decided that they would themselves build their own homes. So this little image here is a part of one of the plan drawings they had, which I have a few copies of still about the office somewhere, and the people who became the families who really still are the basis of what is Public Forestry, that is the Shaws Road Gaeltacht. Now for them, I suppose, when they built their first house in '69, very quickly we moved into the period of conflict and troubles and pogroms in the city. And this little collection of images is of Bombay Street in the lower Falls. Bombay Street was burnt to the ground in 1969, August '69, and at that stage the council pretty much decided that they couldn't really rebuild the street. So those who built the Shaws Road Gaeltacht decided that they would build the street themselves, that they would form a housing association, that they would use their skills and their abilities to begin to lobby and raise money. They knew they could raise money because they did so for the purchase of the land in which they built their houses. And they started collections around church doors and people's doors and raised money to buy a brick for Bombay Street effectively. And what they did to start the project and to make the thing happen fairly quickly was to use the basic plan of their houses on Shaws Road, to accept that the street front is the street front, the footpaths where the services are, and the plot depth is the plot depth. So they were doing this instinctively probably and not really realising that there is kind of townscape mileage or urban design mileage inside that kind of notion. But they decided to do that and add a few other house types. The top right of the image, you'll see what is a 3-story house, living room on the first floor, garage underneath, bedroom, allegedly a roof terrace that became just a flat roof actually, but that was the intention. And of course, having done that, they then decided that they needed to do something else. So when they got their planning permission for their homes, they also got planning permission for a small community hall, with the intention that they would build a small nursery school or a school for their own children. Realised fairly quickly in 1971 that there was no money for books, that there were no books in Irish in the northern educational system. There were some in the south, but they couldn't afford to buy them. So what we did, and this was my first job as a 16-year-old effectively, was to take some books in English and either write the word in Irish on the page or write the word in Irish on a sticker and put that on top of it. And these became part of the school system, I suppose, really, in a way that people volunteered their helped out where they could, and fundraised as much as they possibly could. My second job was this paper bag for a bookshop, which was then based in Andersonstown. So as I was going through college in the early mid-1970s, I was also trying to work voluntarily in this little shop at the corner of Avoca Park in Andersonstown. But it was only a small part of a range of projects that were developed through those who led that Irish language kind of movement. They were the same people who set up Ballymurphy Enterprises, White Drug Industrial Estate, Garrison Football. They had a building construction company, they had a picture framing company, and a number of other enterprises. And this little shop was really to try and raise money to keep the school in funds, because at that stage there was no money to pay the teachers other than the families paying for the teacher themselves or by their friends trying to help raise that money. The White Drug Industrial Estate was an idea that they would be able to buy a piece of land on the edge of the city, in Upper Springfield Road. They would build what was then called an advanced factory, which was then the system that IDB then did. You could build a factory and hopefully the business would come. But shortly before the business certainly came, the site was occupied by the British Army under Operation Motorman and was then closed down. And I'll come back to that after a minute or two as I walk through this series of slides. So this is a kind of stock image of the city that we all know. This is taken from the south, looking towards Titanic and towards Cave Hill, Ormeau Park, the bottom right, the centre commercial city in the centre of the image. And it looks kind of north, doesn't quite cover much of the south, but it definitely doesn't cover West Belfast. And that's part of the problem, I suppose, in this city, that the west like many other areas, really were removed from what was a connection to the commercial core. All the work of regeneration in the city in the 1980s, 1990s really focused on the centre core. There was very little inner city areas, and there was very little intention to try and find a way to deal with those inner city areas or connect to them in any kind of real way. So it's really no wonder, in a way, why people did then continue to try and work inside what became, for many, many people, a kind of labyrinth. They worked on a road that wasn't particularly well respected or acknowledged, and their areas of enterprise and activity was within that road or behind that road or behind that other house, or within layers and layers of labyrinth. Now, I firmly believe this kind of quote from Joan Didion, whose work I really enjoy reading, and I think it's, from my point of view, it's completely true. And there are other, obviously, ways of saying that, and there are plenty of poems who've said this much the same kind of way, that if you want to love a place, you've got to spend time on it and make it, in a way, in your own image, because most of us, in a way, come back to yourselves. So this was a map that we did in the practice about 2010 or thereabouts, maybe a bit earlier. I think actually Fergal Murray might have worked on this one. And this was to try and look at the city with the core in the centre, but also to try and see where the green spaces are and where the opportunities are. So the bits of white are potentially where the opportunities are. The bits between the white and the green and the black are also where the opportunities are. And that really has been the basis for trying to search for projects for both what became the Irish language movement growth in Belfast, and became for me an avenue for work, an avenue for cajoling and helping others to lobby for work for themselves. Over the period of the 1970s then, it became clear that the school had to lobby hard to get more accommodation built for their school kids. This image is of the school kids in 1984, I think, going to what then became a kind of formal cluster of mobile buildings. And I quite like that notion of mobiles, that you can take something and lift it and move it. And by doing that, that you can infect and impact in another place. These buildings were, when they finished here on the Shaw's Road side, they were then taken and used elsewhere. Some of them went to, I think one went to Kiel and one went to Castlewellan for a period of time. So the things moved over a period of time and influenced others and helped others find a place or a home for their children's education. At that stage, of course, the school only got recognition officially in 1979. So for those 8 years from 71, all of the payments were entirely from fundraising to pay for the teachers and pay for the accommodation. By 79, with official recognition, there became some money to at least pay for the teachers. In 1984, of course, the funding at that stage was 80% funding, and that gradually changed over a period of time to becoming then now, and all school projects, whether it's Irish language sector, mainstream sector or integrated school sector, all projects are now 100% funded. It may be difficult to get the funding, but they are now funded, thankfully. So, pardon me. So that we then, the first project in a way became, or the first building project became the Bunskull Football First on the Shaw's Road. And that period from 1984 to when this school was built in 2000 was really and primarily the work of politics and the work of continual lobbying and engagement. The school was commissioned in 1981. I began to do the drawings, the first drawings for it on A0 drawings, generally every year, continually from about 1982, 83 onwards to 1986, 1987. The opportunity came though with the Good Friday Agreement and the work between the ceasefire and that Good Friday Agreement period, because that was really about formal engagement and engaging with a level of government that wasn't open before, in a way. So by 98 and 2000, it became clear that the Department of Education and others had to find some means to fund this school. Now, for a while, the funding was very slow to be offered. So there was a very straightforward suggestion made, and it wasn't made as a joke, it was made partly in earnest, or at least opportunity was there in earnest, that if the school department didn't fund it here, that the money would be sought from the Department of Foreign Affairs in Dublin. And once that was raised, then there became a meeting at a very high level within government. So I attended a meeting with Mo Molam and a number of other advisors and department officials. And then after that meeting, got a call on my way down to a meeting in Dublin to say, could we get this school on site inside 6 months? And of course, the answer is yes. Now that then opened the doors for a number of projects for the Irish language sector across the city, and I was lucky with colleagues and others to be involved in the realisation of those. These are just a couple of images of that school, which is now 20 odd years old. It's a very straightforward, simple school, double-loaded corridor. The top image, the top of the page is north, and to the upper side of what is the school, the grey tone in the middle, that cluster of houses is really what is the Shaws Road Gaeltacht, and then behind that and all around it really are new family homes that were built from the 1980s onwards. So when the Shaws Road families moved there, first of all, they moved into the open rural place. I'm conscious of my time here, so if I drift in by taking too long, then just stop me and we can shorten some of this presentation. The second school, which followed fairly quickly afterwards, was Bunscoil Clevigive. That is the Black Mountain School. And this image is taken from the central kind of courtyard, looking out from it to the Black Mountain. In fact, trying to look towards the hatchet field. And I think what became increasingly, I was increasingly conscious of and aware of, was the opportunity for history, myth, placemaking, name-making, exchange, language, the gaps in language, the gaps in translations, for a way to make creative work. And within this one, I suppose the Black Mountain, this is in Ballymurphy, it's off Ballymurphy Road. And Ballymurphy Road was then, in the late 1980s, early 1990s, was quite a tough place. By the time we got this site, up in towards 2000, it became a slightly easier place, but was still a labyrinth inside the labyrinth in a way. We were very conscious and aware that for those who lived in that kind of area, for every day of their lives, whether it was by opening their curtains in the morning to look out the window or walking out on the street, what they saw at the end of their view was the Black Mountain, that had a place in their home place and their making of home, not just because of where they went to for recreation, for activity, but also because it was a kind of power of presence over the top of them, and was used up until very recently as a place from which to proclaim either slogans or mantras or captions in a way that might encourage people to think in a certain particular way. So the idea was that you come off the road and go into the site and turn your back on the mountain, and then go into, if you can see my cursor on the screen, go into a little courtyard space. That little courtyard space took you to a small porch and into the school, and you were then overlooked by the school secretary and by the principal. And then you entered into a room, you turned right into a kind of a connected collective resource space, and above that to the corridors that led you to the hall. And then the classrooms were clustered around the space with an idea that you could play with the walls slightly, still get the 60 square meters, and allow people to have spaces to fatten into or widen into, or have different types of teaching space. And with the glazed partition between that and the resource space to find a way to let the teacher and the teaching space be more fluid. The difficulty, and I suppose in a way the thing that annoyed me about the school after a period of time, was that there were many architects who visited this building not long after it was built, with their school principals for schools they were then working on, to say that you couldn't do the like of this because this broke the rules, and actually the rules had changed. This is entirely within the standards of the Department of Education's handbook for schools, and still is. And it's only a very simple plan with a hole in the middle. Just so happens that hole can be hall space, classroom space, or play space. That's looking from the other way towards the hall. And within the hall, that from the back of the hall, you could look through the high level window and get a view of the mountain, and in fact get a view of the hatchet field, which is either a hatchet because it's hatchet shaped, it's hatchet because it has a bloody history, or it's just a local name that has stuck. Those are the space for creativity, hopefully. Some of these images you'll have seen probably before from some other things, and I'm happy to share this presentation afterwards if it's useful. We'll compress it and email it through to you if you wish. This little building is currently closed, is about to be remodeled or refurbished. It was built at an area which is the very top of the Broadway Falls Road. The building on the right is the former Beehive Bar, the right hand side of which was subject to a bomb, and the guy who bought it and restored it didn't actually restore it. He just thought he did a quick photocopy of something, and I know what he did, but he certainly didn't help remake the Beehive Bar. So this was a little brick building, 3 stories, an office building. At the time it was built, it was meant for one use and one user. We had some ideas that we might be able to inhabit the roof at some time, and that might still be possible if we can do that in time. So by the time these buildings were built, the 2000s were moving into the mid and late 2000s or thereabouts, by which time there was also an establishment of a group which was called the Greater West Belfast and Greater Shankill Partnership Board. And that partnership board really was to try and look at an economic task force that would say, how might we begin to build enterprise and employment and focus energies in the inner parts of the city, across all inner cities, and it happened on all parts of the inner city areas. So a number of people lobbied quite hard that there was already a cluster of buildings that were coming around what is now the Cultural Land in the Falls Road. That is a former Presbyterian church, and I'll show that shortly. And this little NAS building, and there's a school beside it. And there was a growing Irish language secondary school, Mackel First Year, now College to First Year. And it made sense in a way to cluster activities around this and promote this idea of a Gaeltacht quarter. And that had legs, I suppose, in a way. It became picked up under the programme for government. It still remains within the programme for government and is now also part of Belfast City Council's agenda for quarters within the city. We decided, in a way, there was an element of resistance, I suppose, or lobbying to try and make this thing kind of happen, because there was a pressure at some kind of level, and the usual political kind of pressure in a way that said, okay, you've got this notion about an Irish language quarter or a kind of Gaeltacht quarter with some projects that have happened and some others that may be in the pipeline are getting close to fruition. But there's also a growing interest and body support for an Ulster Scots kind of group, and that they also want to do some projects. And that what we should do within this kind of Gaeltacht quarter notion was to hold fire and to hold back and slow down on some of these other projects until the Ulster Scots agency groups got themselves up to the same kind of level. And then we were both at the same kind of level playing field. We would both kind of lift together. Now, we resisted that pressure in a way because it made no sense. And it also made no sense in a way because the Gaeltacht quarter is entirely about bottom-up projects. Those who founded the Irish language community in the Shaws Road, the five remaining families who bought that site, had a very simple idea. Their idea was not about the grammar and the accuracy of language. It was about communication and communicating with their near neighbours and doing things from the bottom up and doing things yourself. What became then at this kind of time, 2007 or thereabouts, for those who were leading the Ulster Scots group and agency, was really about trying to do it the other way around. Was trying to say we will teach the teachers and the teachers will then teach others, and that will find its way down from the top. So I don't think those two philosophies actually sit very well together. So we took a view in a sense to say that, okay, you can do the things for the by and by, but also there's a need for the here and now. And that all those who wanted to make a difference with that kind of very clear ambition in the 1960s, rooted and all that kind of stuff, and back through all the kind of legacy things I spoke about in the past, also still had merit and strength, and it should be accepted and adopted. And that's the attitude we took. And out of that then, 2006, 2007, there was a body formed, the Gaeltacht Quarter, well, at Carry Gaeltacht at Ciaran, which is Gaeltacht Quarter Limited. And it became subject to a number of plans that were assisted by government funding. Effectively, Deloitte helped on a number of those plans quite a bit over a number of years. And Deloitte had been working with a guy called Clive Dutton. And Clive from Birmingham, and now dead, unfortunately, Clive worked with Deloitte on a number of other kind of projects. And we respected his regeneration kind of flair and his reading of place, and we invited him to come over and meet us in Belfast, which he did, and was back and forward on numerous occasions. And one of my colleagues in the Gaeltacht Quarter Board delivered a eulogy at his memorial service in London just a few years ago. Now, Clive came back and forward a few times. We brought him back for this plan, this big Gaeltacht Quarter plan, which was 2013. And the 2013 plan was to try and set the agenda for the next 20 odd years, and we're now partly through that. The idea was that we would really look at what might be we were looking at it really as a Main Street project. That is to say that in this left-hand image, the plan, where my cursor is the rectangle in Cultural Land. That is an art centre really. That was the centre of an area from the Dunville Park to the former Beachmount Leisure Centre site, and therefore, pardon me, very close to the bottom of the White Rock Road and the parklands that offers in terms of green space and moving around the city in a different kind of way. And the Dunville Park is one of the Victorian parks that was built about 1890 or thereabouts to provide leisure space and recreational space for those who were primarily working in the mills, and some of those kind of mill housing and row housing you can see just left and right above that park image. But it's also the street rather, that now goes down seamlessly to the back door of City Hall. Used to be had to stop at the motorway. Now you can go over the top of the motorway and arrive to the back door and go in about your business. So that contact and connection with government we felt was important. But actually, this plan was also about a way to try and frame how City Council were then beginning to talk about where the city should spend money. City Council, as you may know, I think contributed, £20 million or thereabouts to Titanic Signature Project, and really wanted signature projects across the rest of the city. In the east of the city, the Conswater Greenway is probably the signature project, although there are a number of other things happening in the back of that, and that's good, and I welcome all of that. And we lobbied hard that there was not going to be a single £20 million project for West Belfast, that the Giltop Quarter Plan was the signature project, and it would include a number of projects that would be done incrementally, that we would add to the cultural land. You could add to some other buildings. There was the work that had to be done around the Beachmount Leisure Centre site. There was the work at St Mary's University campus and the Royal Victoria Hospital and St Dominic's University School, that in themselves have 1,000 pupils in St Dominic's, 1,000 pupils in St Mary's University College, and 20,000 plus employees in Royal Victoria Hospital. That all of that is the very component that any area wants for a mixed use 15 or 20-minute neighbourhood or city. And in some ways, this is really a town within a town. Belfast, as we all talked about in the past, has been about a series of small kind of villages. And given where we're now going in this kind of current COVID and what may become post-COVID environment, where people want to be looking at what a 15-minute or a 20-minute neighbourhood might mean, this area has all the ingredients of that kind of plan and idea. This little map, and I'm not spending much on this really, is just to try and record where the Langmead projects are around the city from the west, and where the area we're talking about really is the area around about here. The two green areas, Belfast City Cemetery, Milltown Cemetery, and the Bog Meadows, and then the Royal Hospital just there at the corner of Dunville Park. This drawing is neither here nor there at one level, except it reminds me about Saul LeWitt. And Saul LeWitt was an artist, a great friend of Brian O'Doherty, who I had a good fortune meeting about 20 odd years ago and worked with him for a little project. But Saul LeWitt had an idea, which I quite like in a way, that is that the ideas are also work, and that all of that relies on others to help execute these projects. And the little diagram on the right-hand side is a number of projects that couldn't have happened without the help and support of a number of other architects. Honored Sport at College de First at the bottom, RSUA in the middle, and Radio Falsey at the top. Maybe we'll come back to some of those later. I mentioned the White Rock Industrial Estate a while ago. So when the people who just formed that company and also got a range of shareholders, I happened to be one of them. I was probably 15 or 19, had either £10 in my pocket or £100 in my bank. Anyway, whatever the figure was, I gave that money into the company to try and help do whatever they could for this little enterprise to build this industrial estate, and didn't think any more about it until, of course, the demilitarisation of all the former military bases and camps around the city, and the return of this industrial estate offered in the first instance to those who formed the company, who were then in their 70s and didn't want anything to do with a company, and suggested it should be returned to Invest NI. But from that offer and return, they got roughly £500,000. So they wrote to each of the shareholders and said, do you want your money back, or an investment or a dividend? Are you happy to roll it into a number of Irish language projects? And everybody said yes, they would. So £250,000 went to build, or towards building of this little nursery school in the grounds of Bunchville Clevigive. And the other 250 has gone to a project hasn't happened as yet in Downpatrick in County Down. And this little project, in a way, was to try and look at a two-room nursery school, to try and look at the language of the previous school I showed you, the courtyard one with the hole in the middle, and to say, well, if that was the big sister and you're going to school and you're taking with you your little sister, can the building be the little sister to that big sister school? So it's a very simple proposition that deals with entrance lobby in a way that isn't unlike the entrance lobby of the other one, and this little courtyard in the centre into which the kids can spill out from their two main teaching places. It's just a little simple project. And that's the plan of it. And the bit in the middle, if I can get the cursor to move, is the little courtyard space. And these are the teaching, well, not teaching, but play spaces and nursery rooms, backed up with support and toilets and all the rest of it. The cultural land I mentioned, the cultural land, the Presbyterian Church lost its parishioners over the period of the 70s, and by the end of the 70s, early part of the 80s, was effectively vacant, and it was up for sale. At that stage in the 1980s, money from government generally went to church organisations, and the Springfield Charitable Association was one such organisation that was initially established by the Catholic Church, and it was looking after and does look after currently elderly people and providing them daycare facilities. But at the time they bought this building, and it was rented out for various uses. It was a carpet store, I think, for a while, and then lay vacant. And then because they had a need for the secondary school, those who founded the Shaws Road moved in and had their first secondary school, 9 pupils, inside this building, with a guy called Fergus O'Hare as their first principal, and I'll talk about him later on. After a period of time, I did a bit of work. Mark Hackett myself worked on the ground floor for a period of time, and then in my former practice, Mackel and Doherty, we did this then delivered by Doherty Architects for the project on site. I'll talk a bit about college to first year. I'm sorry if I'm going on too long, Ciaran. Just tell me to shut up and I'll do that. The Beechmount Leisure Centre site was formerly the Wallace family home, also lived in by the Riddle family, who are well known throughout Belfast, and they were one of the big industrialists around the city. So this was their front garden of their home. So they had a house which is still remains, and this was their front garden leading down to the Falls Road, which is pretty much in the same location that it is now. We were asked about 10, 12 years ago to look at a possibility to say, okay, if the school with the Department of Education is going to do an extension and a new sports building, how might they deal with the land in a way that offered other possibilities? So what we were saying was, okay, at the bottom end, between where the pitch may go and the actual road of the falls, there is opportunity for something else, and that something else could be a building that folds and bends and lifts. And there's a piece of land which is still available, we're still trying to lobby for, that could become, it could read in a way as ground that is really about landscape. That is the former idea about this being a garden out the front of this old Heritage building would actually still be manifest in some kind of means, if at all possible, that the garden would be under, within and under whatever is built on the site. I did a little sports building with our colleagues in the practice. We did a sports building, and Doherty Architects did the extension to the school. And we looked at an idea. The idea for the sports building was really to say that the school for a long period of time had no sports facilities, like many other schools. So when you went to the school today, in the daytime, you took your bag, you got on a bus, and you went out to your sports facilities somewhere else, in a hard pitch or a hard hall somewhere. And because of that, then really sport was not central or useful to how the school actually operated. You went to your class and did your work, and there was very little play space. At that time, when the school was operating in this kind of cluster of buildings, this pitch was not available to them. It is now, thankfully. But what we tried to get to in a way was to say, well, actually, the way up to the Heritage, that's the Heritage building just there, the way to the Heritage building in a way should be about encouraging people to not just view the sport, but actually there are other levels of sport. Maybe flirting is a sport, and maybe talking to your friends and family are a sport. This is a co-educational school, and that there's opportunity in that for intergenerational, co-educational and other opportunities that both build creativity, and hopefully people will also begin to take active participation in active sports. This was a drawing that was done to test the kind of quality of that. That became the kind of built reality before the landscape matured. That's looking from the practice pitch across to it. You'll have seen some of these before. Some of the drawings that were done, we try to draw these things, whether they're published or not, try and draw them in a way that they have a rating, but try to pare back and take off all the kind of layers of technical information and room names and everything else, and just look at it in a kind of graphic or a sense. It gives us both the spur of the architecture, hopefully, and an idea about how we begin to record and work and process work. So it's looking from the flirt space, or past the sports building, down towards the south of the city, and to Windsor Park. in the sports hall itself. We're taking too long. I'm not going to go on about this intergenerational space. I'll come back to that some other time. This image was taken at night time. You can just see that on the left-hand side of the image, the walk through the high-level bridge into this kind of covered area with a view down into the minor hall, a view outside onto the pitch, and the way into where the classrooms are, and that's also a place for recreation and sport, and you can sit there and enjoy it. And then down below, see this kind of flirt space and the pitches and the activity and the view over the city. And then we use that kind of graphic medium, I suppose, in a way to make a little fold-out bookmark that we try to do as a way to mark each of the kind of building projects that we've been involved in. Getting close to the end, thankfully, I'm sure you're all saying. This is Radio Falcha, and the image on the right, some of you may recognise. I'm fairly friendly with Robert Balla, painter from Dublin. Robert, as you may know, trained as an architect, didn't finish as an architect, took up a life as a musician, playing bass with the Chessmen, I think it was at the time. And he's a fairly talented, very, very talented artist, and also passionate about politics and about place and about community. And Robert has been central to various competitions in the west of the city during film and football, judging mural competitions and others. But this little diagram on the right is really about checking diagrams. It's about saying the top left image isn't quite right, that's not quite right, that one's possibly okay, and the one below is possibly okay. So if you want to make a composition or arrange things in a certain way or evoke a certain quality, you've got to go through this process of editing and making the mark. And for too many of us, at least in my reading, and I don't mean to be cynical or abusive to anybody, there are too many projects that are built, I think, by all of us, not just others other than me, by all of us that are too diagrammatic, that we need to find a way to test those diagrams and not go with the first assumption and push and push and push. And this little piece on the left is just trying to look at how this simple radio station building began to emerge on the site, notwithstanding the proximity of near neighbours and therefore the impact of that on the modelling choices and development choices. And this building was modelled heavily in terms of simple cardboard models to see how you would place it, what the overlook would be like, because we had to do quite a detailed public consultation process as well, as you may expect. Drawings you may have seen from other things, and then just a few images before I move on to one or two final points. I suppose in a way, part of the idea about this building was not just that it was on a site where there were former three-storey houses with a pitched roof. That is really four-storey form, effectively, and very close to mill buildings. And my memory of some of those mill buildings, which may be wrong, is that they were had a base of a black engineering brick, or in some of them they were painted black or painted brown, and that base ground was a kind of a recurring kind of memory. And also that this building, Radio Falcha, is very close to an art school, which is where the Belfast Gaelic League had its place, just over the motorway bridge on the other side, now in the middle of what is the Belfast Met campus. And that building, as approach, had a very simple little passageway between a number of different users. And then you went into a room on the ground floor with a little stack of rooms, one above the other, which were classrooms and meeting rooms and whatever else. But also in a place and in a culture and in a climate where we have crudely 6,000 languages in the world, of which roughly one dies every single week, and that continues always, all the time. And that notion of fragility and permanence and the place of language out of the labyrinth, that is, how do you locate and interrogate what a radio station in Irish broadcasting might mean on a public venue, notwithstanding all the other kind of contextual requirements you have to try and deal with. And also in a place where it's right beside the kind of some of the starting point of the conflict in Belfast in 69 and 70, and is within 150 metres away from interface walls, not just one or two, but gates. So part of the idea of this was that the manager, Fergus O'Hare, who was the guy I mentioned earlier as the first principal of College to First Year, who now manages, and is just retired, now manages Radio Falcha, would go out in the mornings and would slide back these perforated screens. That is, he took the notion of porosity, because the Falls Road, Falls comes from the Irish fall. Fall is hedge, and a hedge is porous, and a boundary which is porous allows more possibilities. So the manager takes the porous wall and slides it back and opens up the public space to the public and invites them in. that these days under COVID times, the building is unfortunately closed to the public on the ground floor. The activity is still going on elsewhere. This little image, the low single-story piece, is actually the courtyard. So you enter into a courtyard open to the sky, and the hope would be that you can come out of that courtyard into the bit which is the grasscrete, and that something can hover or float or be mobile above that thing, and you can move that, and in fact, somewhere else in the way I was talking kind of earlier. We're getting near the end, so you've probably seen these in recent perspective magazines. This project, RSUA, we designed in practice and then renewed the planning twice, and then because of procurement rules that was mentioned earlier, we didn't make the random selection list, and Paul McAllister Architects delivered this and delivered it to the drawings, to be fair to him, and did a good job. And the building, in a way, is meant to try and deal with some reference to Broadway, some reference to the street, a way to play with scale and image and edge and roof garden and open things up. And I suppose that idea we can begin to use the roof for activity and views out and connect out is important, I think. And not just because it's a way to link to the College de First site, and the College de First site where there's possibility is just there where I have the cursor. Literally probably about 400 meters away. If this works, the green space on the left-hand side of the road is, I think, the opportunity for the Gilcock Quarter project for the months ahead, and certainly for the years ahead. That is straight edge, straight frontage of about 300 metres. And the little Brennan Doherty project is just at the bottom of that image, a labyrinth sculpture in itself. So as a final image, really, I suppose this is really about saying we can and should find a way to remake that road, remake that edge, claim the ground, make the edge porous, make the border porous, and lift things up and use all the levels we possibly can and all the imagination that all of us as architects bring to a project to bear to realise both this project and really for any of us, any project. So as you may say in Irish, array lin, which means let's move on, let's progress. Garmila Magath.
Ciaran, thank you very much. That was excellent. It was great to get the context for those projects we've seen in perspective, etc. I was very interested in that because it clearly illustrates the contribution made by architects in enabling projects. And I think that architects use their skills to make projects viable, through economically and culturally and politically, even as you've said, and that holistic vision that architects can provide, even before we start, getting into the detailed design of a building or even the conceptual design of the building, I think isn't recognised outside of architects, and I think it is something we need to ensure that other people realise what we can contribute. And certainly I think your work there and your presentation illustrates that perfectly. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you, Donald. Thanks a lot. I'm sorry if I went on too long a bit, but I was trying to compress it down.
No, it's cool. I think you could probably, any one of those buildings, you could have talked for the same length of time about them.
Possibly, yeah.
Yes.
Donald, do we have a chance, Justin? I see there's a good few people still here.
Yeah.
Any chance for questions, maybe?
Yes. Yeah. Any questions for Ciaran? Hopefully you can see the comments, Ciaran, on the meeting chat. Yeah. No, I agree. Everybody's find it very interesting. Yeah. No, I think
Joan has a question.
Oh, Joan. Yeah. Yes, Joan.
I'll ask you a hard question. If you were going back to 1970, and what would you do differently?
I'd probably come with her on the other side, Joan. What would I do differently? I'll tell you what I would do differently. I would record all the stuff that I didn't record. It's only really, I suppose in a way, part of the opportunity of this presentation was to try and pull some things together, and you begin to reframe it slightly differently and realise that some of the things that you looked at, actually there is a kind of a lineage and a kind of a connection between them all that wasn't obviously because you're doing the work wasn't obviously immediately clear. So I probably would have been more conscious about trying to find a way to both record it and value all the various aspects of it in a way. I think there was a period probably at the early part of the 1980s, and when we were within the government discussions, particularly about the schools, where we were meeting them as groups and we were been kind of played one against the other on some levels. But so there's a way to say there were broadly two kind of groups within the Irish language kind of community in Belfast. There were those who were what they were saying amenable and would just accept what had been told, and there were others who were quite aggressive and saying no, we don't accept that. No, what is the actual rule? And I was with a group that kind of fell in that kind of latter category because we just wanted to keep pressing for the explanation, and probably we realised probably too late in a way that actually Clive Dutton, who came in to meet us in 2007, 2008, brought an enormous connection with government at all levels, not just locally, but also in Westminster. And we probably should have been more aware of those kind of things much, much earlier on. But that's just the process of either growing up or finding your feet, maybe, or finding your voice.
Thank you.
Ciaran?
Anybody else?
I'm just going to sneak one in since I can, Donal. Ciaran, I love the bit about do it, don't talk about it.
Yeah.
I think if we could all live to that, that's amazing what could be achieved. But do you get a sense at all of there being a drift away from that mantra over the years? Sometimes when things get bigger, slightly more institutionalized, greater structures in place, people become maybe more reliant on the machine to kind of take over, and there's an expectation that it's somebody else's responsibility.
Yeah, I'm not sure if that's entirely true. I mean, I think probably within the Irish language community, there's a fairly small kind of cluster of people who are leading most of these things, and they are very determined, particularly those who are leading the College to First Year project.
Mm-hmm.
That school has grown from the 9 pupils in the 1990s to over 700 pupils, and the need for a second secondary school, and they are very committed to finding a way to keep making sure you stick to what might be a plan. The plan will change, obviously, and we may have an idea to say, well, okay, if you take the first families, the first 5 houses, now has about 25 houses around that kind of cluster and no more space for development, although people around them also use Irish as their medium of communication. That site I was showing at the very end, that kind of triangular site near the Beastmount site, there's opportunity there to do a hybrid building. Now, what we have found at a level which has been, I suppose, coming out of our experience, particularly working with Clive Dutton, is to realise that we will work with government. So we have a joint secretariat between what's called Forwards First, which is an Irish Language Development Agency, effectively, and there are 4 or 5 of us on the kind of board of that, and Department for Communities. And we meet them regularly, we impact on them regularly, and we're trying to develop what we put forward, or we proposed as a hybridity project. That is to say that government always asks people, generally in community groups and others, to say, it'd be really good if you two guys work together. And if you work together, you get a better project. And we're saying, yeah, of course we'll do. Well, of course we'll do that. But what about you working with another department? Because you're either silo bound in your funding streams, and why can't you actually do a pilot study and make the pilot study the Gaeltacht Quarter residential project? And actually, it isn't residential. It's also community and cultural and school and something else and landscape. And we just had to keep, and that's about continual work. So I think I have another 20 years of us to go, hopefully, or thereabouts. May only get one more building done, but anyway, there's the work which is really about architecture in the broader sense and not just about building. So we'll keep at it. We'll resist that drift. Although I quite like the notion of drift because it allows you to do different things, probably.
Yeah. I hear since I don't see anybody else jumping in, I'm gonna steal a final one. Any advice, Ciaran, for younger architects who want to make things happen, not just be part of delivering things that are there in the office to be delivered, but actually want to be instigators of change?
Yes, well, I mean, I suppose in a way, I was thinking about this recently because certainly when we were involved in those initial projects for the Irish language groups, particularly from the Shaw's Road thing, there was no real intention to say we are going to be revolutionaries or make kind of change. There are different ways of doing things, obviously. And actually, it was just a very pragmatic decision to say there was a need and we had to find a way to meet that need. And can the architect bring a level of understanding the mechanisms of how government might work at some level and understand the mechanism of getting a building built and using that kind of skill. Now, the difficulty I think currently is around procurement, because all of the stuff I've been talking about to date from the very late 1960s, when I woke up on the 6th of October in 1968, and when I was 13, realised the world had kind of changed. My work after that was really about trying to find a way to help your own community. And when I went through, did architecture, the choice for me was a very simple one to say, I had no choice but to stay here and find some way to give them back to the people who helped built me up, I suppose, in a way. And that was through the path of architecture. And that relationship has been a series of relationships with a number of people who've been similar people over all those 40 or 50 odd years. Now, the current procurement rules don't really allow for that kind of network of relationships to have legs in terms of getting work done. But there is still, though, the possibility to say that there's money that can be found to do the starting of those projects and to collaborate with somebody else to help maybe deliver the last part of the project. So I don't see why young architects can't be saying they've got ideas. And I'm co-leading a group of students on the theme of Gaeltacht at the minute at UU. So there are about 20 students or thereabouts. And one of their next projects will be to take that Radio Falcha Westlink area around that and say there are potential ideas there for things that will hover or float or be mobile, and we can make simple things and get those ideas out and find do any of them have any kind of legs to ground them in a way that it can be used, and that the young architects who are the current young students become young architects of the future. They will find a way to get ideas, promote them, lobby for them, make networks, collaborate with many people as you possibly can, realise what the power and influence is, because it comes from government and it comes from increasingly from council, and use your own skills to lobby with other architects to help join the force to make the thing a realisation, if possible, if that's a useful answer.
You're on mute, Ciaran.
I was just wondering if Joan was coming back in, was she?
No, I think the hand's just been up from before. Are there any other questions? Well, if not, Ciaran, once again, thank you very much. That was excellent. And it was an interesting discussion there at the end too. That's great. I know that presentation was recorded, so hopefully we'll have that again in future.